here. But if you see your name on this stage, please come here.
Great.
Mine's not on here, so I'm leaving soon. Actually, very hurt. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here for a very important conversation that involves a number of our programs. We expect a number of ambassadors to arrive. I don't think they're all here yet, but I think former OAS Ambassador Luigi Einaudi is here. There he is. Yes, we got one. And we have our program directors here. Duncan Wood is on the stage. Paolo Sotero is right in front of me. He's the only person sitting in the front row for some reason. And our program directors from Africa and Asia will be in and out of the conference, but the conversation. But we're delighted that to welcome the rest of you. In an address to a joint session of Congress asking for a declaration of war in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed that the world must be made safe for democracy. Segue to 2014, and we're still working on it. As a former 9-term member of the United States Congress, I have served personally as an election observer in 8 countries around the world, most recently in Egypt and Tunisia, and tonight I head for Ukraine to be part of the NDI, National Democratic Institute, delegation to witness that election on Sunday. I can tell you, and I think everyone here agrees with me, that while elections are important, and they surely are, they do not necessarily make a democracy. Think Egypt. It's one thing for there to be revolutionaries in the square, and it is one thing to topple a government, but it is another to have the political skills and organization to put together a better government. I would ask whether the Egyptians yet have gotten there after 3 difficult years. As Fareed Zakaria wrote in his excellent book, The Future of Freedom, Illiberal Democracy at Home and Abroad, democracies sometimes have a, quote, dark side. And the lesson of Rome's fall is that for the rule of law to endure, you need more than the good intentions of the rulers, for they may change. You need institutions within society whose strength is independent of the state, unquote. With elections coming up in Brazil and having just concluded in India and South Africa, the Democracy Works project cannot come at a more important time. We all know that the challenges are great. Brazil's economy this year is set to grow at about 2%, continuing one of its slowest rates of expansion since the 1990s. India is ranked 94th out of 177 countries in the latest Corruption Perception Index. And in South Africa, more than a third of the workforce, or the potential workforce, is unemployed. These democracies have all come a long way, but they will be tested in the coming years on whether they can continue to deliver sustained and inclusive economic growth. The Wilson Center tracks these developments very closely. For this reason, 4 of our programs, as I just mentioned, are co-sponsoring today's event: our Brazil and Mexico Institutes and our Africa and Asia programs. And here to help us launch Democracy Works in Washington are 2 former Wilson scholars and principal authors of the report, Ann Bernstein, right here, and Simon Schwartzman, right there. Ann is the head of the Center for Development and Enterprise in South Africa, which is its leading policy center for social and economic development. She was previously a member of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, a fellow at the National Endowment of Democracy, where NDI is housed, and an invited faculty member at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Democracy Works was developed in part during Ann's residency at the center in 2013, so of course we take full credit for it. Simon is a leading Brazilian social scientist. He has served as president of the Institute of Labor and Social Studies in Rio de Janeiro, professor of sociology and political science at leading universities in Brazil, and was president of the Brazil Institute of Geography and Statistics. They will be joined by Eswaran Sridharan. Have I got it? Eswaran Sridharan, academic director of the University of Pennsylvania's Advanced Study of India. And by the way, just to brag personally, I was at the Wharton School on Sunday, just 2 days ago, where my son-in-law graduated. Let me give a shout out to Washington Post columnist and national treasure Ann Applebaum. Yes. Where's Ann? There she is. Hi, Ann.
Far left.
There's meaning to that. That's quite hilarious. But your writing, by the way, on a number of things, certainly including Ukraine, gets my attention every time. You're really enormously impressive. Who will moderate the discussion later in the program. Ann recently featured this project in her latest column. A must read, obviously. How many of you have read Ann's column?
0.
Not very good. Is it on our website? Ann's column? Come on, vaunted Brazil director. It will be on our website by this afternoon, so you can all do, wilsoncenter.org. Everybody got that? It'll be on this afternoon. The show begins right now.
Well, thank you very much for that great introduction. I'm not sure we're needed here after that speech, but we'll amplify a lot of the points that have been made. And a very big thank you to Paolo for organizing this event for us. A few years ago, it became clear to us in South Africa that we knew a lot about America and the West, but we didn't know very much about other democratic developing countries. And so we initiated a think tank network of leading sort of think tanks in important developing countries, and we chose Brazil and India. And we started to learn a great deal about these very different societies, but it soon became clear how similar the challenges were that we were all grappling with. As democracies and as developing countries, there was a lot more in common than you might think. And out of this arose this particular project, and we were fortunate to get Ann Applebaum and the Legatum Institute's interest in what we were doing. And so I'm reporting on the essence of the report that we've been launching in London and Washington this week, that really pulls 15 different research papers together and sort of the so what document. Now you might be asking yourselves, why are these people coming to Washington to tell us that democracy matters and that democracy works? It's a bit like bringing coals to Newcastle. But I think our findings and what we're going to be saying is a bit more important and subtle than it might at first appear. This project started with a big question. After 2008, Western democratic capitalism had been knocked off its pedestal. It looked tarnished fairly and unfairly. And at the same time, you had authoritarian China seeming to know where they were going and delivering great growth rates and moving people out of poverty. And in that context, the question we asked was, can we turn the spotlight to what's also happening in the developing world? Is there a democratic alternative emerging in the South that we could start talking about as well? Can we make the case for democratic market-based societies outside the West? And because in many ways it's hard to see the way the world is going that a new kind of approach is going to come out of the West and get credence in the developing world. Now, if you're concerned about human rights and freedoms, and if you believe in democracy and a market economy, then this really matters. It's our view that there is a growing global contest between authoritarian approaches and democratic approaches in many countries across the world. It takes many different forms. I was recently in Nairobi and was surprised to discover not so much that the Chinese are building Nairobi University and various other places, but that very prominent people are feeling this contest. It's kind of China and America, and its moves towards authoritarianism or towards greater democracy. So this is live. It's not some academic idea. Whether you hear the leaders in Ethiopia, both the former leader and the current leader, who are openly dismissive about democracy, a waste of time. I know what's good for my country, or Rwanda, or a number of other places. But in general, there's just a new magnet in the world, and that has important consequences, I think, for America, but also for all of us who believe in a democratic market-based system. Why these three countries in particular? Well, we had limited resources, and it seems to us that although they are very different countries with different histories and all sorts of differences, nonetheless, there are three vitally important countries that punch above their weight in their own region and globally, and are pivotal countries in their continents. Our report's organized quite simply, and I'll quickly take you through that. I don't need to talk about how we understand democracy, because it's exactly how Jane Harman's just described it, that elections are very important. You have to throw the rascals out at regular intervals, or have the possibility of doing that, but that it's much more, and it's all the institutions, from the rule of law to the separation of powers, to the freedom of the press, freedom to organize and speak out, and so on, that really matter in building the fabric of a democratic society and culture, and doing that in developing countries. So we start by looking at the achievements these three countries have notched up in the past 20 to 25 years. Brazil's return to democracy, South Africa's establishment of a democratic society for the first time, and India since the market reforms of about 1991. In that period, all three countries have notched up significant achievements. And we highlight these because too often people who live in those countries, or outsiders, focus on what more needs to be done, and there is a lot to do, and we underplay what has already been achieved. And it seems to us that these are quite significant. All three are liberal, constitutional democracies, with all that that implies. In the past 20, 25 years, economic crisis led to market reforms, macroeconomic discipline, and the benefits of that. These reforms delivered results, and this was buoyed by the very positive economic circumstances of the 2000s. So in all three countries, think of India with its over 1.2 billion people, where some 200 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty. That's pretty significant. Think of Brazil, where the statistics are stunning. You have single-digit poverty now, you have single-digit unemployment, you have a middle class that's been increased by some 40 million people into the lower middle class, and you have a Gini coefficient that's moving in the right direction. South Africa, too, the baby of the three countries, of 52 million people, where in 20 years you have established a truly non-racial society in many respects. Residential integration, frankly, puts America to shame. It's been very successful. In a whole lot of areas, there are real fundamental changes. In terms of results, you've had steady economic growth over the period. Could have been higher, but steady nonetheless. And you have millions of people who now have access to electricity, to running water, to modern sewage systems, and to housing. What's happening in these three countries is an enormous process of inclusion into the modern economy, into the modern world, and as equals, increasingly. We take one area in our second section, which is corruption, and we try and illustrate why we think democracies have an advantage in combating a scourge that occurs across all countries. There's an Indian website called IPaidAbribe.com where you can report bribes you were forced to pay in order to get some essential right that you are owed. And there's a lovely story of the transport department in Karnataka state in India, where the official in charge decided we were being cited much too often, and he called in the I paid a bribe team to help bolster him in taking on the officials and saying we have to change the culture and get rid of corruption. On the other hand, you have some citizens in China who wanted to start a similar website, and within 2 weeks that was shut down. So the truth is, it's not that democracies have more corruption than authoritarian states. Authoritarian states don't let you talk about it. They might have show trials, but the full depth of corruption in everyday life, in every sphere, is not allowed to be revealed. Whereas democracies, you have very many different channels through which to complain about corruption, to try and fix it, through the legislature, through organizing, through civil society movements, through new laws, whatever. So if you look at the depth of resources democracies have to fight corruption, we think it's hard for authoritarian societies to match that in this battle that is so vital in so many countries. We then look at the challenges that the countries face today. And very simply, economic crisis 20, 25 years ago, centre-left democratic governments turned to the market, albeit reluctantly, but introduce macroeconomic and other reforms, and these deliver results. In the 2000s, the words of an Indian industrialist, that looks like, gee, high growth is a new normal. This is easy. We don't have to reform anymore or any further, and we can redistribute quite a lot. And in different ways, all sorts of redistribution takes place, and rent seeking is allowed to expand. Then the financial crisis hits. It takes a while to play its way through these three countries, but now each one is in economic trouble, pretty serious economic trouble. They also, in a sense of have to deal with their own successes, because they now have an increasingly urban middle class that is recently out of poverty, is holding on with their fingertips often because they're heavily in debt and do not want to slip back. But they've also found political voice, and they're shouting and talking, as is our right in a democracy, on we want better services, we want better transport, we want better in all sorts of ways. We want better, more effective government dealing with crime, and so on. So these are tricky, perhaps even dangerous circumstances in all three of these important countries. The challenges they face are economic. They have weak manufacturing sectors, they have rigid labor markets, they have a need to produce jobs, certainly in India and South Africa, for millions and millions of young people. And in Brazil, they need to bring down their informal sector and get more people into formal jobs, as they do in India. But they're preventing the sort of lot of own goals taking place, in addition to the difficult international circumstances. All three countries have truly terrible basic education systems, and they're struggling with infrastructure, and they have a reluctant, sometimes even more antagonistic attitude to the private sector. So they're not benefiting from the dynamism of more competitive markets. So a whole lot of very tough challenges in these societies. They also just little hints of slippage when it comes to democracy. It's different in each country, different areas, the judiciary in South Africa, the press in India, and other sort of examples. So big challenges that now face these three countries. We then have a section on reform, which has two parts. The one is, okay, what do you do about all of this? And we have come up with, at a broad level, a lot of specifics, but a fourfold, bold reform package, which is very similar across the three countries and absolutely essential. in all three countries, and I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail. So a bold reform package in all three countries. But that's quite easy to do. What's much harder is, so what's the politics of reform in a democratic developing country? And we try and throw out some insights and ideas on how to think about this and, again, what's common across the three countries. Three big takeaways there. The first is that reform mongers, if you like, need to build on the characteristics and advantages of democracy in order to be successful reformers. And we give examples of how to do that. That democracies give you ways in which you can lead and you can pull people together around new ways of doing things. The second, which is an underlying theme throughout this report, is that democracies need effective competitive markets to deliver. Problem is, capitalism doesn't sell itself very well. In fact, in many respects, it undersells itself. And large companies undersell the enormous benefits of just doing business. And this is going to have to change if these countries are going to adopt a more full-blooded approach to market reform, which is, in our view, absolutely essential to get the higher growth, get back to higher growth that they need. The third point is that if, in different ways, the first round of market reforms in these three countries benefited everyone, but big companies, big trade unions, big government benefited more. And there's a perception that market reform has to do with making fat cats richer. So if you're going to sell this, you're going to have to make it very clear, and the proposals have to deal with this, that actually this second wave of reforms is going to benefit everyone. The unemployed looking for jobs, small firms, the people who've been shut out of the economy or held back. So access into a growing economy is going to be vitally important, and selling that this is good for everybody is going to be very important. Let me try and pull this together. It would be nice to stand here and argue that democracy is absolutely essential for growth and development, but empirically this is false. Authoritarian societies have delivered growth and development, at least for a period. Many have not, but you can do it. The claim we're making might seem like a lesser one, but actually is very important. Can you have growth, development, and inclusion and human rights and freedoms? In our view, the evidence from three important countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, is compelling. And we conclude with a resounding yes. It's not democracy and human freedoms or human rights that is holding these countries back. It's bad policy choices. It's the failure to fully embrace markets and the private sector. It's weak institutions that succumb to corruption and crony capitalism. In fact, these countries need more democracy if they are going to successfully put together the coalitions and implement the reforms that are required. In large and complex developing countries, vested interests often preserve the status quo. But we would argue that democratic politicians and leaders can build new coalitions for reform and use the many mechanisms of democracy to change the definition of what's in the national interest and what national priorities should be. There are, of course, no guarantees that these countries will consolidate and get higher growth again, but we believe that they can do this and that a second wave of reforms is absolutely possible. After all, in response to economic crisis some 20, 25 years ago, democratic governments have done this before. And if they do, the emerging democratic market-based alternative from the South will be strengthened. None of these countries offer a blueprint. Nonetheless, they do offer important insights and lessons for other developing countries, middle income, and perhaps others. And we think their existence and their success thus far, albeit imperfect, is of vital importance for all those concerned about democracy and market economics in the West and in the world. So the bottom line then is that there is a democratic alternative emerging from the South, that India, Brazil, and South Africa embody this, and they're three pivotal countries to watch. Thank you. Thanks. Simone.
Okay.
Do you want me to speak? Do you want to speak now, or shall I ask you a?
Whatever.
Okay, you didn't. I understood that. Sorry. You want me to moderate now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I misunderstood what the plan was. Okay, so let me just say one word before asking others to speak. I just want to echo a couple of things that Anne said. As she described, this was a sort of 2-year project. There are research papers that went into the final report that she has just mentioned. They're available on the Legatum Institute website and on her website, the Center for Development and Enterprise. And I'll just say why I was interested in it. I am not an expert on any of these three countries, as Jane said, and as some of you know, I'm in fact come from a background where I've written for many years about Eastern Europe and more recently spent some time in North Africa. What interests me about this story is that the global debate that Anne described is very real. A few days ago, the president of Egypt made a comment. I don't have it written down now in front of me, but it was something like, we can't have this Western-style democracy in Egypt. It just won't work. And the point is that to many countries, to more than you think here in Washington, it does seem like there's a dichotomy, and you have to choose. You can be Sweden on the one hand or China on the other, and those are the paths to growth. Whereas these three countries really illustrate that it is possible to be an ethnically divided, socioeconomically divided, unequal, relatively poor country and nevertheless maintain a democracy, and that democracy confers some advantages, as well as conferring some degree of human rights, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and that with having all those things you can at the same time have economic development. So my interest in it was from the perspective of countries that I work in and know about that have gone through dramatic political changes and are looking. Everybody always looks towards something. Everybody wants to be like something else. And politicians, when they're making changes, always use shorthand, and they say we want to do this the way Singapore did it, or the way that France did it, or the way that Germany did it, and people use those shorthands to explain what it is they want and where they want to go. And one of my interests in this project was that it would contain all these. It would show some of these different examples. I'll bring in our Brazilian and Indian collaborators by asking them each a question. Shri, one of the things that you've often said, and that appeals to me about this project, and you're not the only one who said it, is that in a funny way, India, which is the one country in the world where democracy should never have worked. It doesn't make any sense. There are, I don't know how many multiple languages, multiple ethnic groups, tribes, wealthy people, cities, rural areas. Nevertheless, there is beginning to be a very strong argument that in India, democracy is the reason why it works, that if it wasn't for democracy and that system of power sharing, that it would be very hard to have any growth in India at all. I wonder if you could speak to that. It's an argument I've heard you make. Maybe you could explain a little bit better than I can.
Yes. Basically, what many scholars have argued is that India is a counterintuitive case. And what explains it being sustaining a democracy for 6.5 decades with the interruption of the emergency in the mid-70s, which lasted less than 2 years, when it doesn't seem to have any of the prerequisites which the literature says it should have. That is, it was at independence overwhelmingly poor, rural, illiterate, and so forth, plus religiously, linguistically, and ethnically, that is caste and tribe and all, very heterogeneous. So it had both things stacked against it, both poverty and heterogeneity. And how did it remain a democracy? And the answer is really that the Constitution India adopted after 3 years of extensive debate, when every article was debated and everything written down to reduce discretion, was basically a power-sharing formula, if you will. A sort of a system in which all significant groups would have a share of power. It was secular, that is not discriminating on the basis of religion. It was caste discrimination and untouchability was explicitly outlawed in the Constitution, and there were explicit minority rights. It was a federal system, not to call itself federal, but it was effectively a federal system. And then later, after 1956, became a linguistic federal system, sort of linguo-federal units, which is a kind of a ethnocultural federalism, where every significant linguistic group had control over its own territory, sort of a self-rule. So it was a system of power sharing with a bottom line below which no group could slip of assured rights. And that gradually, over time, led to, despite the fact of secessionist movements in some states at certain periods of time, a growing sense of identification as Indian. Apart from whatever else you are also Indian. There was no contradiction there was no identity contradiction between being an Indian and being whatever else you are. So, in a sense, a power-sharing constitution is what enabled India to both become a nation by identification, and also which sustained democracy itself. So, I mean, I think if I've answered your question.
Yeah, for other countries where there are these divides, that would be a kind of, not that India is a blueprint for anybody, but it would be a kind of thing that one could study and learn from. Simone, I've asked you this before, but I'm going to keep pushing at it. The question about how it was that in the early 90s, suddenly Brazil, which had seemed to be constant, terrible problems with inflation, macroeconomic instability, was suddenly and inexplicably able to get itself together and produce a real set of economic reforms and change. I mean, there are a lot of countries that can't find their way out of this kind of instability. They can't figure out how to get from a disorganized economy into the mainstream. Brazil found it somehow in the conditions of democracy. Can you describe a little bit about that and how it happened?
Well, I think that one obvious answer is that when the problem gets very, very, very difficult, people look for solutions. And Brazil in the mid-90s was facing a very, very difficult moment with the hyperinflation and the economy completely out of control, and the state not working at all. And so this created, there were several attempts to stabilize the economy. The Real Plan, which finally worked, was not the first, was the third or fourth attempt to do that. And finally, it was able to succeed because of, it was better conceived. There were the political conditions to implement it. It was not just a kind of dealing with the monetary things, but a much more broader and much more deeper reorganization of the public sector. I think that more broadly, going back a little bit to the question that you raised to Sri, in a country so large and complex, Brazil is a very large country, has been, democracy is really a way of dealing with things which is better than one group trying to impose their own will or vision on everybody else. And democracy didn't start in Brazil in the 90s. Brazil had a constitutional monarchy in the 19th century. And of course, you could say it was limited, it was with the slave system, but still it was a constitutional democracy. And monarchy at that time. And then there were several periods in which the country had different kinds of arrangements, and then it slapped back to authoritarian government, and then this authoritarian regime didn't last because it was much easier in a way, it made much more sense to allow the different sectors of society to appear and to participate in a bargaining system. However, whenever you do this, you have to make compromises. You have to different groups which you cannot just push everything in one direction and exclude the others. This is one problem we're facing now. So it was easy, in a way, thanks to the economic development in the world markets in the 2000s, first years, to at the same time to have the economy going, to have more money getting into, to increase public expenditures and to spread out benefits to different groups. poor and not so poor. And of course, there are some benefits which went to the poorer segments of the population, but also very rich people also got very much richer during this period, benefited from that. Now we are in a difficult situation again, because now the level of expenditure is very much higher. The public sector expanded, and the surplus from a very favorable economic context is not there anymore. So the question now is whether you are able to build up a new agreement again, in which you say, well, let's first of all use better the public money we have. Let's see if we can do the same thing with less money, or actually we can do better with the same thing. Let's see if we can reorganize the economy so that we will stop being at the bottom of the doing business measurements and allow a better climate for business. Let's see if we can make better arrangements between the public and private sector to increase the level of investments. This is very obvious. It's a very interesting case, by the way, because the current government, has been ideologically very much against private investment, the partnerships with the private sector, up to a point where suddenly there is a whole World Cup coming up and there is Olympic Games coming up. Everybody's looking and nothing is working. So the government said, well, let's now very quickly try to make agreements and bring private sector to come in. But then they didn't do it very well, so things are not working. But at least the realization is there that if you don't open up, if you don't bring foreign capital, investments, knowledge, competence, and allow more people to participate, you won't do it. Well, this is very much in the debate today in Brazil. We are approaching a national election, and this is very much the debate: which kind of arrangement you can do in society, and whether this current group in government or the opposition will be able to do it. But I think whoever wins the election, this will have to face these issues. Mm-hmm. How you make the economy more efficient, how you reduce the budget, and how you transform the current policies, social policies, which worked up to some limit, into second-generation social policies which could deliver good education, good quality health care, deal with urban problems which are deteriorating very rapidly, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. It now falls upon me to introduce to you your own scholars. So I'll go through them one by one. Duncan Wood is the director of the Mexico Institute here. I've heard Anne say several times that if she were to expand this project, one of the countries she'd like to include would be Mexico. You know, there's also Indonesia, there's Turkey, there's some other obvious countries that you could put in this group of comparisons. And I'm wondering, first, how this argument strikes you, and also whether you could speak. So one of the central issues that this report tried to grapple with, so probably the most important criticism of democracy that you hear, particularly of developing world democracy, but actually, why not, American democracy, is that there's this enormous pressure to redistribute wealth. And in a poor country, the pressure is even greater because most of the voters are poor. I'm very roughly characterizing the argument. How does Mexico deal with this? And how, is there a competition there in the same way between the pressure to redistribute and the pressure to have sort of good, sound economic policies and balanced budgets? And what does the resolution of that look like?
Yeah, it's a very, very important question. First of all, let me say that I think Mexico would fit in perfectly into this study. I mean, many of the things that have already been discussed apply to Mexico. Some, however, are a little bit different, as you would expect. On the question of democratization and redistribution, the first point that I'd like to make is that when the Latino Barometro does its poll in Latin America and asks Mexicans whether they believe in democracy, and the question is, do you believe in democracy as the best system above all others under any conditions? Mexico consistently has the lowest numbers in Latin America. Less than 50% of Mexicans believe that democracy is the best system above all others, no matter what the conditions. And I think that's a very, very telling thing. But now we have to ask the question why. And it's directly related, I think, to economic management. In fact, what we see is that although we've made significant, impressive strides in transforming the Mexican economy, Mexico has become a manufacturing powerhouse over the past 20 years. It exports more manufactured goods than the rest of Latin America combined. It's fully integrated into the U.S. North American economic space. It's got more free trade agreements than any other. All this great news, and yet we have unacceptable poverty rates. 45% by some standards, by some measures, of people live in poverty. and around between 11 and 15% in extreme poverty. We see a very marked distinction between the north and south of the country. A lot of people in the south who live in extreme poverty. But it's more than that. It's the perception, I think, on the part of many Mexicans that they cannot get ahead. And I think we've all had conversations like this in countries around the world, where you sit in a taxi and you start a conversation with a taxi driver, and one of the first things that you pick up is that, does he believe his children are going to have a better life than he does? He's busting his butt every single day, going out there onto the streets, risking life and limb quite literally to bring in income, and he wants his kids to have a better life than him. And consistently, my conversations in Mexico have pointed to the fact that Mexicans don't believe that their kids' lives are going to be better. Now, for many years, there's been a couple of options. One has been migration to the cities, one has been migration to the United States. And a third option has appeared, which is organized crime. And that's something which is extraordinary, and hits at the heart of democracy as well. Now, another economic aspect I'd like to point to is, of course, competition and monopolies. The Mexican economy, as a recent McKinsey Global Institute report has noted, there are two Mexicos in terms of the economy. There's the big, successful multinationals that really are world beaters, or at least world competitors. And there's the smaller businesses that employ a huge number of Mexicans, but which are not doing well. They're constantly having to fight for their daily bread. And that creates the perception that although we've had a very, very robust, although with challenges, transition to democracy over the past 25, 30 years, democracy isn't working to make the lives of Mexicans better. Now, this takes back to your initial question. Does this mean that there are pushes to redistribute? Well, there are, but they're not strong enough. What we see is that because of a three-party system, the party that represents the redistribution agenda has actually never been able to win power at the national level. It's been able to win at the level of states and at local elections. It's become the largest opposition party at certain points, but it's never won national power. And that's a crucial component here. The other two parties, although they have many things that distinguish them, at the present time share a market-oriented economic agenda, which is focused on making Mexico more competitive, more productive, more open for business. There were some signs in the fiscal reform package last year that there was a move against that, in the sense that there were more taxes applied to the middle classes. There was a suggestion early on that value-added tax would be added to food and medicine, which would hit the poorest harder. They pushed back against that, the ruling party, and they decided no, instead they were going to raise taxes on the middle classes. In fact, that seems to have been political suicide, because the middle classes, as in the case of many of these countries, is now much bigger than it was, and people who consider themselves to be the middle class, and people who were hit by that. One of the most bizarre things that was included in the fiscal package was a tax on pet food, because pets are a middle class phenomenon, a middle class luxury. Now, that's something which, and it's a neat little story, but it suggests that, the government was hunting around for things that they could do which would actually win them favor with the poorer classes. It didn't work in the end. But we see this kind of tension going on with Mexico, and the redistribution agenda is not there yet. But I am wondering when it's going to emerge at some point in the future.
Well, I think some of the colleagues here will have something to say about how the redistribution agenda has worked or not worked in their own countries when we get around to them. But Marina Ottaway, you study and work on another part of the world. Marina Ottaway, for those of you who don't know, is a senior scholar here. And I associated her so long with the Carnegie Endowment and their Middle East program that I was surprised to see her biography on this panel. But she's been working on the Middle East for many decades. Is this of any use to you, studying North Africa and the Middle East? This kind of conversation, is this something that you find useful in your work? Are there arguments you can make from it?
Yes, I think first of all, there are two things here. One is the theory, and I totally agree with the arguments that have been set forth that it is possible for countries to thrive economically under a democratic system. In the part of the world I work on, the problem is, how do you get to a democratic political system? The question is not the choice of economic policies. The question is, are the elements in place that would allow a democratic transition? And what I would argue is that, by and large, what we have discovered with these uprisings lately is that you really don't, you have a paucity of political groups that are capable and willing to talk to the majority of the population sufficiently to get a democratic system functioning. What I mean is, by and large, when elections took place in these countries, and by the way, you mentioned the Latin barometer, and the Arab barometer shows consistent support for democracy in all Arab countries. People say very consistently everywhere that democracy is the best system. But in the end, when it comes to elections, they are presented with choices that are almost forced choices. That is, the choice seems to be between Islamist parties and the older regime, essentially. And the lack, and I think the main problem in getting beyond these clashes that we have been witnessing recently is really that you need political parties to have a democracy. You need organizations that are willing to go out and and talk to people. I'll give you an example. In Egypt, you mentioned Al-Sisi saying that there is not going to be democracy for 25 years. Essentially, it's a luxury we cannot afford. But the counterpart is one of the so-called liberal parties in the country, the Wafd Party, which has been in existence since the 1920s. And they explained that they were not going to go out and campaign in the villages or outside Cairo, essentially, in the forthcoming parliamentary elections, because if they go out and talk to people, people want to know what the party will do for them. And they don't want to put themselves in that situation. And essentially, what you are talking about is political organization. And I'm using the WAFT, but you find parallels in all countries in the Arab world that essentially claim that they believe in democracy, but but are not willing to talk to people. And as a result, I think these countries are stuck in a pre-democratic condition, so that the whole debate about whether democracy allows economic growth is kind of a moot debate for these countries. The final point I want to make is that they also have tremendously distorted economies. This is nothing that we don't know because of the oil wealth. And I would argue that what we are witnessing more and more is that this oil wealth is distorting not just the economy of the producer, but is distorting the economy of all other countries. Because one of the main, for example, if you look at Egypt right now, the major income of Egypt is the money that comes from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Essentially, the one very important source of investment and also of support for Morocco is money coming from the Gulf countries and so on.
Mm-hmm. No, that's unique to that region. Alyssa Ayers, Senior Fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia Council on Foreign Relations, and also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia until looks like about 10 minutes ago, so quite recently. Last fall. Recent, okay, yes. Right. So very recently. First of all, if you'd like to comment on the report, we'd be grateful, but also as somebody who comes out of the government, are these, is this kind of work, is this paper, these kinds of comparative, this argument of a democracy, that's something that could be useful to somebody in government now? Is there a role you see for this argument?
Yes, definitely. I thought this was a really interesting report, and kudos to the Legatum Institute and the Wilson Center for pulling this together.
And the Center for Development.
And the Center for Development and Enterprise in South Africa for putting together what I think is a really, really valuable report in bringing together the experiences in a digestible way of these three very large, important democracies, free market democracies in the South. One of the interesting things, and Sri, of course, is an expert on the topic of coalitions, but we haven't talked so much in this panel this morning about the challenge of coalition government. But India has been through 3 decades of an experience of having very difficult and complex coalition governments because it is so diverse. And oftentimes you hear people talk about the experience of coalitions as a democracy tax or a tax on growth because it slows down decision decision making because there are genuine disagreements in the country over which direction to take on economic policy or different kinds of reforms. The interesting thing about the election that just concluded in India is that in many ways, and I think it'll take some time for people to fully absorb the results and analyze what the mandate means, but somebody who campaigned in India on a platform of economic growth and good governance, in fact, on a platform that talks about, in many ways, shrinking the government. There was a campaign phrase of less government, more governance that Mr. Modi used while on the campaign trail. That's a very interesting new type of a way to be campaigning in a country like India. And he got a mandate, a single-party mandate. There isn't a coalition needed to form the Indian government. There are allies of the BJP party, but on their own, the BJP, under a platform specifically of economic growth and good governance, crossed the halfway mark in India's lower house of parliament. So that's actually quite significant in terms of what it means in a country, whether the political economy of campaigning on free market economic growth is actually sellable politically. And so I think in the coming, let's say, 3 to 6 months, we'll start to see how this will be implemented, but it's a very interesting point of shift, I think, for India. Just speaking as a former government official, what I was looking for in part of this report, and obviously it wasn't the mandate of the report, but I think there's a very interesting direction that it could go further, would be to look at the role of the IBSA, the India, Brazil, and the South Africa grouping as a kind of international formation or an international minilateral organization, and the powerful signal that the IBSA grouping can send around the world about its experiences with very large-scale democracy and free markets and what that means in terms of delivering growth and opportunities and freedoms to their citizens. IBSA was active briefly during 2012, sending a mission of foreign ministers to Syria and providing some recommendations on what to do about Syria. There hasn't been so much lately. Of course, the recommendations didn't produce a solution. Nobody's recommendations produced a solution in Syria, so that's not a comment on the IBSA forum at all. But I think it would be interesting to see what more this grouping of 3 countries with their very specific backgrounds in democracy from the South could do on the international stage.
Maybe we could toss in Mexico as well.
Yeah.
Matthew Taylor, assistant professor, American University School of International Service, and a specialist in Latin America and specifically Brazil, and he's written an intriguing book called Corruption and Democracy in Brazil, which seems to line right up with our concerns. And so do you agree with one of the arguments of this report is that democracies talk more about corruption, but that they also have multiple ways of fighting corruption, that there are multiple institutions, and that that's an advantage. Do you,
Sure.
do you agree with that?
Yeah, and I would just echo, first of all, congratulations on a very nice report. Taking a step back before talking about corruption, one of the things that strikes me about Brazil and the role of democracy, I started to put together a research project on this, and I was looking at the 40 middle-income countries that Brazil is a part of. And when you look at those 40 countries, Brazil is in the lowest quintile in terms of growth over the past 30 years under democracy. But when you look at the Human Development Index, Brazil is second, after only Botswana, which is a country of 1 or 2 million. So the fact that Brazil has been able to do this, I think, says something about democracy and what democracy can bring. I was going to say, though, that I think that Brazil has been going through perhaps what we could call the second phase of the deepening of this democracy. The first phase Simone talked about, which is what I would call a state-led phase, a phase in which the bureaucracy really was very important, and epistemic communities within the bureaucracy were kind of leading democracy where it was trying to go. And so you had people like prosecutors creating an independent and autonomous public ministry, which is one of the key institutions against corruption in Brazil. You had a community of so-called sanitarists that led a very important push towards universal health care. You had a group of finance ministry officials and treasury officials who led the Plano Real, but also before that really created the conditions for fiscal stabilization. And so that first phase was really state-led from within the bureaucracy. And the second phase that's begun now is a phase in which I think there's a bit of a tug of war between civil society, these bureaucrats, and then also, and this is very important to the question of corruption, state capitalists. And I don't know as much about India, and I don't know as much about South Africa, but in Brazil, when you look at corruption, one of the things that sort of strikes me about Brazilian democracy and its ability to undertake the sorts of economic reforms that you all have discussed is indeed its ability to kind of overcome a legacy of state capitalism that still has very, very deep roots, both in the ideas that policymakers hold, but then also in the institutions that are created. And so if you look at a list, for example, of the beneficiaries of BNDES, the National State Development Bank loans, or you look at a list of the construction companies that are benefiting from the World Cup, if you match those lists up against campaign donors, they're almost identical. They map on perfectly. And so this is one of the sort of major concerns before you even get to the institutions that you need to fight corruption, is whether the system itself is set up in a way that constrains policy change and that constrains the possibilities for accountability. And so I guess that's a very long way of getting to an answer to your question, but I think that the answer to your question is democracy really has permitted the creation of a number of institutions, a legal framework, and even civil society organizations to fight corruption, like the Movimento Voto Consciente that's mentioned in the report, I believe. But it's sort of a race against this old or older state capitalist framework to see who will win out.
Right. We have until about 12:30, which is not a huge amount of time, but I might let the panelists, if they want to respond briefly to anything that was said. Anne, you want to do it now or later? Is it?
Well, let me say something about South Africa, because that's really, Africa and South Africa has been talked about least on the panel so far.
That was an accident. There was the person who was supposed to speak at Africa couldn't come. But anyway, so.
Okay, I won't take this as a slight. I think South Africa is at a critical point, and some of the issues that have been raised are very relevant. It's interesting that no one's really talking about our election, which is certainly not as hopeful or as dramatic as India's. I wish that it was. But we are 20 years into, if you like, post-liberation politics, and that's a very different place from India, which is 6.5 decades into that. Nonetheless, you are seeing some interesting dynamics where the ANC did lose significant support in some of South Africa's important cities, over 10% in 3 cases, which is interesting in South African politics. The big question in South Africa is, in a sense, not so much the old corporatist network, but if you like, the new one that just fitted in very well with South Africa's old bad habits, where we do have growing corruption at the very top. And can civil society, can the other factors in the society fight back sufficiently to stop this overtaking the good that is in the country? So that would be one very important issue that's kind of underneath the good side here. I suppose, if you start talking about the dark side of democracy, which is important, crime, organized crime, and a range of things from Mexico and other places, you can focus on that, and those we would see as very important to combat. On the other hand, one of the big lessons I've learned in this project is really from Brazil, and these remarkable statistics that in some ways are quite hard to explain. You don't have to fix everything in a country at once in order to make real progress. So Brazil has lots of things to fix still. But it has managed to achieve some remarkable results. And so I tend to think in terms of how you make progress in a society and what are the key priorities to do first. And it is really important to in a sense, not be overwhelmed by the negatives or the dark side, but to look for the key catalytic actions that, if you got them right-ish, would help to sort of lead to some other things that help fight other areas of problems. So I think one's got to be careful about emphasizing too much the dark side of society, really. It's not so much the dark side of democracy, but also of society.
Yeah, I would say that there is a lot of organized crime and corruption in authoritarian societies, too. So we just hear less about it. Simone, that's...
I think Matthew made a very interesting point about the first generation of reforms made by the whole technocrats, the economists, etc., and parts of the bureaucracy. And then I was expecting him to talk about what will be the second. And I think he skipped the second. We are now the third, because the second was the attempt of the PT party, really, to mobilize what they call organized society to run the country. So you had the teachers' unions will do education policy, the health workers will do health policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The unions will run the economy. So the whole project of the Lula regime was to use the unions, the organizations which existed in civil society, support them, give them money, and give them power. The Indians will run the institutes for the Indian population, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the question is that all this, the other thing, just adding to this, there was a whole policy of creating councils of everything. You have a council for education in each municipality. You have a health council in each locality. So the whole idea was to organize the whole society. Society will run it. Well, I think that it didn't work. And what happens today is that many of these groups, which were so-called organized society, became interest groups supported with money given by the government. So it became a kind of professional groups. And now what you have is a third thing, which are people going to the streets and protesting and trying to organize outside the political system. So the question is, can you, and these people are claiming for direct democracy. They say, they are on the left of the government. They don't say, well, this government is not very good. This organization don't represent us, and we are the people. And you say, where is the organization? No, we don't have any organization. We just, each of us speak for ourselves, and we are just the people. So the question is, can you build a society on that? And my answer will be obviously, you cannot. You need legitimate political representation. And the political representation needs a political system which works properly, and people recognize in the institutions, in the political parties, that they have their representatives there. And I think so that we are in a difficult situation because of that. I think the technocrats are still there, and they still play a role. You have all those alliances, which are not just the technocrats, but the alliances of the big interests, big business corporations, people who do public works, and the political elite, the traditional political elite, which is a very strong part of the situation. And the question is how you move ahead, and it's not very easy. But I think I think we have the second attempt to mobilize society, which failed. I think deserves more attention.
Shri, do you have a comment to react? Or
just a more broader general point about compatibility of the redistributivist pressures that are generated by democracy in a poor country and market reforms. Now, if you can conceptually divide redistributivist pressures, so that is, anti-poverty programs, other kind of social spending programs, into those which are, compatible with market reforms. For example, if you have massive anti-poverty programs aimed at, things, basic needs like water, sanitation, primary education, those are actually growth enabling in the long term. It's what in India are called merit subsidies versus non-merit subsidies. And if you divide in principle those which are growth enabling and those which are growth choking, like recently last year there was a land bill passed in India, became a law. That is, before businesses can acquire any land for industrial or infrastructure projects, you have to get compensate the landholders, the villagers, the farmers at 4 times the market rate or twice the market rate, depending on urban or rural areas, and get 80% of the landholders to agree. Now, that is a blockage. I mean, 80% will not agree. So, at any given moment, because, they think of the short term. So in that sense, if you divide redistributivist pressures into those which are growth enabling or at least growth neutral and those which are growth choking, then you can have a compatibility, work out a compatibility between market reforms and democracy in a poor country. It's what in India is called merit and non-merit subsidies. Merit subsidies are those which are merited, like for primary education and other things, which, or even for higher education. I mean, for things which are growth enabling in the long run, which have social benefits, not just individual benefits to the subsidy receiver. And those which are, non-merit subsidies, which are really, to special interest groups, you give this subsidy or that subsidy, which doesn't have a broader social impact, which are really forms of rent seeking. So, I mean, if one can distinguish between these two types of public spending generated by the patronage pressures or by redistributivist pressures, then you can work out a system of compatibility with market reforms in poor democracies. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I will take, now there's only about 15 minutes left, I will take one or two comments from the audience and then I'll continue the conversation among the group. Does anybody want to intervene at this point? Oh dear, quite a lot of people. So one right here in blue, and then one in orange, and then we'll move on.
Is this on? Yes. I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I want to thank you for this report because it really opens the aperture for many of us who have been looking at these issues. I want to throw in another item that was not included and maybe is just another study. How do we create jobs for those people at the lower 10%, 20%? And in the process, how do we give them a sense of respect? Because if you're dealing, I'm so struck by, I hate to be a Luddite, but it seems to me the technology has really eliminated a lot of people from the workforce.
Thank you. Let's do a few others since there won't be lots of time for questions.
My name is Christina Bejan, and I'm with the Wilson Center. And my question applies to all three countries. So Brazil, South Africa, and India all have a difficult history of racism and discrimination. And I was wondering if you could speak to the current relationship between racial relations and successful democratization. And of course, I mean, the case in India with Modi being elected, is that really a symbol of hope for the lower castes? And I could go on, but please, thank you.
Thank you. And one or two, there's one right here in the yellow tie, kind of in the middle. Right.
Thank you for the report. It's pretty great. My name is Abdel Maliki. I'm with Global Civil Initiative. My question is, how can we bring those three countries to influence the other two members of the BRICS in order for them to be able to have a sense of democratization? Because we already have that group of India, Brazil, and South Africa working together, and the other two, China and Russia, and how can they influence those in order to be able to have some sense, like we're talking about Ukraine right now, what their role? Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to see that. Anyway, one more right there, sorry.
Thank you. My name is
Wait for the microphone, sorry.
My name is Subhash Mungra. I'm the ambassador of the Republic of Suriname to the USA. I think I want to thank you, the distinguished panel, for the interesting contribution. I think it is clear that the major factor in increasing living standards in these countries under research is the redistribution pressure in each of these countries. Now, redistribution is a political decision. So we see the same thing in the US. Redistribution during the last 5 decades has been very bad. The reason for that is that in a democracy, in a capitalistic system, redistribution is decided by the market, which means that those who control the market benefits more from the market outcomes. So, for instance, if you can indeed pursue with Obamacare and increase minimum wage, this is a perfect instrument to improve the distribution system. And another item is the degree in which you enforce the price takers to become price leaders, or to reduce the amount of price leader, because in each of these economy and most of the LDC, we see that the bulk of the consumers are price takers, and only a few are the price leaders in the market. So they control the outcome of the market, and this is another cause of the speed in which poverty can be reduced and you can improve the middle class. So these forces increase competition, which is again a political decision in each of the society, are of major influence in order to strengthen democracy and improve the living standards of the majority of the people. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we go backwards? You first. All right. and please, if each of you, please respond to one of the points that was made, either by the audience or by our colleagues. You don't have to answer everything. Just
Yeah, so I guess I'll just pick the point about redistribution, the ambassador's point. And I think that Sri also made this point to a certain extent, but there's also an issue here of redistribution temporally. And so we've been talking mainly about redistribution in terms of Bolsa Familia that helps the poor today. But I think smart policy and the innovative policy that we would ideally like these democracies to be undertaking includes things like smart regulation, counter-cyclical fiscal funds, revamping labor laws, revamping education to build human capital. And all of those things require fighting today's majorities to fight for tomorrow's majorities. And so no democracy is very good at doing that, or they haven't historically been very good at doing that. No government has been very good at doing that. But these democracies are at a relatively early stage of that.
right. Alyssa.
So there are, I think, two questions that perhaps I could briefly speak to. One was whether it's possible for India, Brazil, South Africa to have a greater influence on the other members of the BRICS, on Russia and China. And I guess from where I sit, the answer to that lies in the success of these three great democracies and in their ability to continue delivering growth, benefits, and a better way of life for their citizens. Because that's the most powerful example. In fact, that's why this report, I think, is so valuable. It's the other reason that I think that the results of the recent election in India will be a quite pivotal moment for that country. So if the Indian growth story can be rejuvenated at this point on the basis of a campaign focused on growth, that will start sending a different signal about what can be delivered in a very large and very diverse democracy. The other question from the back about the power of democracy and society, I think there are kind of two ways to look at this question with respect to India, and Sri might have more to add on this. But on the one hand, I think it's certainly the case that Mr. Modi, who does hail from a subordinate caste background, represents the ability for someone to rise without being limited by accidents of birth. India has had a history of providing political favors to people who are born in political families. It's a very much advantage. But this story from somebody who comes from a very different background of somebody outside of politics, is quite a powerful signal about possibilities in the country. It's also the case that he has been identified with the problems of the Hindu-Muslim riots that took place in 2002 in the state of Gujarat, where he was chief minister at the time. Now, I think there was quite a cloud over him in India for many years on the question of his responsibility for the riots. In the intervening years, the Indian legal system has churned very slowly. The Indian legal system is very slow and very overburdened, but it does work. And there's been now a report commissioned by and submitted to the Supreme Court, which everybody regards as a fine institution, that has not found sufficient evidence to convict him or bring charges against him in the case of the Gujarat riots. And the second thing directly related to this topic is that there was a court decision in Gujarat which reached a conclusion just December 26th of last year that quashed a case against him for lack of evidence. So I think on the question of divided society and how does somebody govern, he has been exonerated by these questions. I think people will be looking to see now how he governs, so that's a question for the future. But I think some of the challenging questions about Hindu-Muslim relations, in many ways the Indian legal system has provided that answer.
Marina, one point.
Yeah, just on the BRICS country, because that refers directly to South Africa. Sorry about that. It really depends on the domestic politics of the country. I mean, China, after all, it's doing rather well. It's certainly not doing worse than the other countries, so that it will change if it needs to change, if it sees that the path forward is blocked, or if it has too much domestic opposition. And the same is true with Russia. I mean, countries don't change if by their own standards they are successful, unfortunately.
Right. Duncan.
I'll touch on the point about jobs. I mean, it's a crucial question in Mexico, but it's not a question of unemployment versus employment. It's a question of formal versus informal sectors, and guaranteeing that workers get a decent wage, that they actually have access to social services as a result of having a job. And there's a number of things that are going on right now which give us hope. One of which was the labor reform of November of 2012, which in fact makes it easier to hire and fire, making labor markets more flexible. And we hope that that leads to more people entering the formal sector. The fiscal reform of last year should help companies to hire. Then there's the education reform, and actually getting a functioning education system in Mexico will help those people that enter the formal sector to have the skills that they need to be competitive. And what gives us hope as well, I think, is the demographic trend in Mexico, which is that we've moved from a fertility rate of around 7 children per woman in the 1970s to just over 2 today, which means that big demographic boom that we saw in the past has ended. And now we have the opportunity to actually have a relatively stable population and to find employment for those people who are there. The challenge in the future is going to be, where do we find the workers from? Mexico is going to look a lot more like the United States and Canada than it does like Central America in the future.
Mm-hmm. Shri.
Just to address the question about Modi, Alyssa has already answered the part about caste, that he comes from a lower caste background. But I think the dangerous thing is about the Hindu-Muslim the Muslim and Christian minorities, which have traditionally been targeted by the RSS, which is the one of the core organizations in the BJP family of organizations. They have already demanded that certain Hindu nationalist items on the agenda, which is in the manifesto, will be implemented, and they've already said that now you have a majority, so you have no excuse. So he has started off by saying that I am going to be Prime Minister for all Indians, including those who haven't voted for me. So that's striking a positive note. But how long this tension will persist and whether it can be resolved, or whether it will at some point lead to a breakdown in relations with minorities. I think things are right now wide open. We don't know what will happen, but I think that India is entering a dangerous phase where the actions of the government have to be kept under close watch.
Simone.
Well, regarding the question of jobs, I think Duncan said what I would say. I mean, it's a question of deregulating in a way the market so to allow more formal jobs to take place. In Brazil, there has been some advancement of that, and many people have moved from the informal economy to the formal economy. And there is a very serious question of the lack of qualifications of the population. People don't have the skills, so education. Of course, there is a general question, much more broader. Is technology eliminating jobs in a broader sense? And if this, we are all in trouble in the United States, Brazil, and everywhere. But within that context, I mean, what you can do is to make people more competent, more able to work, and to create more opportunities for business, for activities to take place, and to make it easier to organize and to participate in the formal market, which means to have the rights for retirement, security, etc. How does this relate with the issues of a race, which I think it was raised here, I think is an important debate in Brazil. All the people who have studied these issues of race, some people are against and in favor of affirmative action based on race, and particularly have been written against it. But regardless of what you stand, if you look at the correlates of inequality in Brazil, most of the inequality has to do with education, has to do with the way you live, has to do with many other factors. And if you are black or white, according to the Brazilian classification, which is not very good, will give you another 5 or 10% of the difference. So there is a difference, but it's a residual difference. So why is this difference is there? There is some discrimination. If let's say it's easier for a white person to get a job in the market than a black person, that's obvious. You don't have this kind of apartheid you had in South Africa or the Jim Crow laws you had in the United States, but still there is a kind of implicit, not explicit, but discrimination which takes place, and you need policies to deal with that. But it's mistaken to think that if you deal with this, which is 5 or 10% of inequality, you are solving the other 80 or 90%, which has to do with the bad quality of education, regional differences, other problems of housing. In fact, there are many other problems which are not related with race.
Mm-hmm. Anne.
Let me talk about race in South African democracy. There are a number of levels in which to think about this. On the one hand, I think race relations in the country are remarkably positive. I was standing in a line to vote 10 days ago, and the black and white South Africans all very comfortable, waiting in the sun to vote when the Independent Electoral Commission is run overwhelmingly by black South Africans who look very different from, they don't look formal, they're dressed in a sort of more kind of casual way, and yet elderly white South Africans are very happy and they're treated incredibly well, and everybody else. So at one level, you could say that race relations is remarkably positive, and that's quite stunning considering our history. At another level, our elections have tended to be racial referenda, where if you were black, you voted for the ANC and the Party of Liberation, and very few other groups increasingly voted for the ANC. What's interesting about the recent election results was that you're starting to see urban black South Africans in particular parts of the country, now 4 metropolitan areas, voting differently, that you can be a black South African and you don't have to vote ANC. You could vote for a myriad of other parties, and predominantly they're voting for the Liberal Opposition Party, which has historically had white leadership and increasingly is starting to have black leadership. I think that's very significant potentially to watch. The most important thing about race in South Africa, there's 2 other things. The one is that increasingly class matters much more than race in terms of how you think about the future of the country. We're getting a growing black middle class and a growing small but very wealthy black class, and they're as far removed from the rest of the population as any previous rulers. So class is becoming important, and inequality is growing within the black community. So I think that's very important. And the last point is you have to have growth. If South Africa doesn't get the kind of higher levels of growth sustained, it's hard to see how you're going to govern a country with our history and with the kinds of legacy issues from apartheid that still remain. So growth is absolutely vital for almost every question you want to put on the table about South Africa. And then the last point, very similar to Brazil, is that you have to get better education, because that is what is holding back the vast majority of black South Africans.
Right. Thank you. And to finish, I will ask Paulo Sotero, who you know is the director of the Brazil Institute here, to say goodbye.
Yes, I wanted to thank you. And first of all, apologies for the confusion initially. I am particularly already in World Cup mode, so I'm not thinking straight.
Understood.
And now, second thing, 2 observations on 2 topics raised. Race in Brazil. next time you go, you will observe the airports. Apologies in advance because they're not ready. But look at the content of the airplanes. The population, in old times, Brazilians of African heritage used to go to the airport to clean the place. Now they go to the airport to take the planes and go and visit people, etc. This is a very important. This creates, actually has created some reactions in Brazil, very interesting. Finally, on the BRICS, and I wrote a little an article about this that is available. So you would be surprised by this skepticism, the deep skepticism that exists in Brazil regarding the BRICS, including among Brazilian diplomats, because although it served some purpose at the beginning after the crisis to sort of start a discussion on reforming the international financial institutions, it looks that it has kind of exhausted itself, and people in Brazil and experts can't see what is the glue, what are the common interests, etc. So deep skepticism, and Brazil will host, as you know, the next BRICS meeting that starts 2 days after the final of the World Cup, and I don't know what people are thinking about having that together. But now, on behalf of the Wilson Center, I wanted especially to thank Alana Putz. I don't know if she's here or not, from Legatum Institute, the colleagues also from the Center for Development Enterprise from South Africa. It was a pleasure to have you here. I hope this discussion was meaningful for all of you, as it was for me. And please, thank you to all the panelists. Wonderful to see former Wilson Center scholars that are forever Wilson Center scholars here with us. And so stay tuned. And this proceedings will be were carried live, webcast live, and will be on our website. So thank you very much, and a round of applause for the presenters.
We have you on the panel. No, not at all. Thank you. Great.
Sorry for the confusion.
No, I coming to lunch.
I'm afraid I'm not invited to Lorena.
Don't worry.
I'm already. You know, I was born the year we lost the World Cup in Rio, so
You're still
I'm
thinking about it.